Good day, World History 2 students. Mr. Deegan, back at it again. We are studying Unit 9, the Cold War, Modern India, and Modern Africa. Today we will be studying Lesson 3, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Ah, yes, it is the struggle between the leader of the United States and the leader of the Soviet Union, both of whom have their fingers on the buttons of very powerful weapons, and it all takes place in the island of Cuba, just south of Florida in the Caribbean. Guiding questions for today. How did nuclear weapons influence the policies of the United States, the Soviet Union, and other countries during the Cold War? Secondly, should the countries of the world give up their nuclear weapons? Some background. The presence of nuclear weapons has influenced patterns of conflict and cooperation since 1945. These powerful weapons have shaped policy. What countries have nuclear weapons today? This shows that. So you have the estimated global nuclear warhead arsenals in 2016. Russia has the most nuclear warheads, followed by the United States, France, China, the United Kingdom, Britain, Pakistan, India, and Israel. These countries have nuclear weapons. But Mr. Deegan, why not North Korea? Why isn't that on the list? We don't know for sure. North Korea likes to brag that they have nuclear weapons, but we need to see evidence. How did the arms race between the US and the Soviet Union heat up? Let's look at this timeline. August 1949, the Soviet Union tests an atomic bomb, and headlines across the United States say that. The United States is not the only country with atomic power. January 1950, US President Harry Truman allows scientists to build a hydrogen bomb, more powerful than an atomic bomb. And in 1952, the US tests its first hydrogen bomb. Here is a photograph of that test, which took place in the Marshall Islands, not in the United States. And 1 year later, in 1953, the Soviet Union tests its first hydrogen bomb. We have an arms race on our hands. How does a hydrogen bomb compare to an atomic bomb anyway? Let's talk about nuclear bombs or atomic bombs. So atomic bombs use fission, which is the splitting of a large atom into two smaller ones. Meanwhile, hydrogen bombs or thermonuclear bombs are more powerful because they use fusion, the fusing of two or more atoms into a larger atom. And you see here an example of how much more powerful a hydrogen bomb is. See these tiny specks on this graph? Well, these are the atomic bomb droppings. Hiroshima, which was the power of 15 kilotons. Mike, Bravo, and Tsar Bomba are the three hydrogen bombs that have been tested. Look at the megatons compared to the tiny kilotons of the Hiroshima bomb. Let's get some bomb vocabulary out there. First, the governments of the US and the Soviet Union used the strategy of deterrence during the Cold War. What is deterrence? It's a military strategy in which a country uses the threat of powerful weapons to prevent a conflict from starting. And this cartoon shows deterrence in the Cold War. You have one side that's saying, on no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate with these powerful weapons. The other side has the exact same message, on no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate. That is deterrence. Part 2 of bomb vocabulary. Both the US and the Soviet Union were fearful of mutually assured destruction, MAD for short, during the Cold War. What is MAD? It's the idea that both sides of a conflict could cause so much destruction that no one wants to start the conflict in the first place. And this image shows you. If you kill us, we will kill you. That's MAD in a nutshell. Let's move on and talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. What was it? This is a definition. A 13-day confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union in which Soviet missile bases were being built in Cuba. When was it? October 14th, 1962 to October 28th, 1962. And a slogan for this crisis might be, when the Cold War got hot. Who are the main characters of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Here they are. Let's start with our president, U.S. President John F. Kennedy, Cuba Prime Minister Fidel Castro, and he is linking arms with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Let's give you some background on Cuba. First of all, the geography. Here's Cuba, the red island in the Caribbean. It is 90 miles from the southern tip of Florida. In 1959, Fidel Castro, here he is, led a revolution to remove a dictator from power in Cuba. And once Castro takes over, he is named prime minister and he sets up a communist government. He runs the military. He runs the economy. So he removes a dictator, but then he acts an awful lot like a dictator. How did the U.S. try to defeat this communist man, Castro? Well, in 1961, it leads an invasion called the Bay of Pigs invasion. It's named after this tiny slice of land here in Cuba. What was this invasion all about? Some Cubans were unhappy with Castro's communist Cuba, and they fled to the United States. And America's CIA agents trained about 1,000 of these Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro's communist government. And American-led forces were defeated in 3 days by Castro's forces. And then U.S. President Kennedy, here he is forced to go on TV and tell Americans that a top-secret CIA operation had failed. This was an embarrassing moment in the history of the United States. How did Castro respond to America's attempted coup? A coup is when someone or some group tries to take over a government. Napoleon successfully led a coup in France, for example. Well, in Cuba, Castro forms an alliance with the Soviet Union leader Nikita Khrushchev. Here they are, arm in arm. And Khrushchev uses Cuba as a bargaining chip in the Cold War to convince JFK to remove U.S. missile launchers from Europe because these launchers could reach the Soviet Union. Why does the Soviet-Cuba alliance scare U.S. leaders? Well, this photograph. It was taken by a U.S. spy plane on October 14th, 1962. This photograph shows a nuclear missile site that's being built by the Soviets in Cuba. And it is 7 days from being ready for action. Also, U.S. spy planes spot 20 Soviet ships that are sailing in the Atlantic Ocean and are headed straight for Cuba. Do they contain nuclear missiles? Are they going to build up the arms in Cuba? It's scary. Here is the fear. If you have a nuclear missile site in Cuba, it can reach all of the major cities in the United States: New York, Washington, Chicago, Denver, Los Angeles. That is scary. How does the U.S. respond to the Soviet threat? Well, on October 20th, 1962, President Kennedy orders U.S. Navy ships to blockade Cuba. And here you see that dotted blue line is the blockade. 2 days later, in a televised speech, JFK asks Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, to remove all nuclear weapons from Cuba, or the U.S. will respond with a full retaliatory strike. That's a threat. This is an actual photograph of JFK giving that speech, and we know from people who were in the room that JFK was shaking as he was giving this speech because he knew they were very close to a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Were the Soviets bluffing? That was the big question. On October 24th, 1962, Soviet ships approached the U.S. Navy blockade. They are sailing southwest in the Atlantic Ocean, and Khrushchev still has not spoken to the U.S. government. Will he give in to the demands or not? Here are the major questions on the minds of the world. Would the Soviet ships shoot at the U.S. blockade? Would the U.S. Navy fire on Soviet ships? And would this all start a nuclear war? At 10:32 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on October 24th, 1962, the Soviet ships stopped and turned around before reaching the U.S. blockade. And this is an actual photograph of the first ship that turned around. This is what U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, a close advisor to JFK, said in that moment. We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked. How did the Cuban Missile Crisis end? Well, Cuba remained communist. It still is today. A phone hotline between the White House and the Kremlin, which is located in Moscow, Russia, was set up for better communication. The Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba, and the United States agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey in Europe so that the US can't reach the Soviets with its missiles. And here you see a photograph of a meeting JFK has with Khrushchev. And we're almost done. Please fill out those summary questions to earn your 30 points. Next lesson, a preview. Here is US President Ronald Reagan, who gives one of the most important speeches in world history. He says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall in 1987. This is a speech in Berlin as the Berlin Wall is right behind him, still separating the East from West in the Cold War. Shortly after that speech, the wall comes crumbling down. Until that next lesson, this is Mr. Deegan signing off.